Great to see everybody here today. We're going to talk now about innovative responses at the local level. My name is Sally Scott. I'm an assistant research scientist in the Housing and Land Use Policy Program at the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. And following up on Pete's plugs for our PPC staff, we have 3 graduate students and myself blogging today. So if you want some interesting perspectives on what's going on, you can go to the PPC website, find the event page, and hit the media tab. And that will pull up all the blogs that we're working on. And we hope that after the event is over, we will continue the conversation through the blog, that you'll be able to comment on the blog posts, and that we may take some of these questions that you've asked that we don't get to answer right now and use them to inform our blog posts. So stay tuned there. So we've had, I think, some excellent discussions already. You know, we've got the big picture background of our climate change and water runoff. We've thought about state leadership and local responses, and we're going to really focus in now on some local innovations and some success stories, I think, of how since the 2008 floods, both in the urban and rural areas, we've got individuals and institutions that have found ways to respond effectively. But we also are aware that there's more innovations that have to occur. And we're going to kind of cover the full range of what has happened and what needs to happen. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today. I'll introduce everyone, and we're going to follow a very similar format to the previous panel, where we'll have our speakers each take about 10 minutes. And then we will have question and answer with a combination of note cards and standing up. So our first speaker today is Dick Sloan, who has probably the longest list of credentials. Dick is a farmer. He joined his father's farming operation in 1978 on land east of Brandon, Iowa, which his grandfather had purchased in 1938. The Sloans shifted from farming corn, oats, alfalfa, cattle, and hogs to corn, soybean, and hogs. And during that transition, they added minimum tillage, no-till, terraces, and contours to their conservation plan. And we'll hear more about that in Dick's remark. I think Dick's shown a remarkable openness to learning and teaching others. He became president of the Lime Creek Watershed Improvement Association in 2006. And he has worked with Practical Farmers of Iowa, Iowa Learning Farms, and the Cedar River Watershed Coalition to promote cover crops, soil health, and sustainable farming systems. He graduated from Iowa State with a degree in biology, and he is a member of the Iowa Corn Growers, Iowa Soybean Association, and the Iowa Pork Producers. After Dick, we have Joe O'Hearn, very familiar to those of you living here in Cedar Rapids, and I think anybody who's probably lived in Iowa for a while. Joe started with the City of Cedar Rapids fairly recently in February 2011 as the Flood Recovery and Reinvestment Director, contributing to the citywide effort that we've heard quite a bit about to recover from the flood of 2008. As the flood programs are concluding and the City of Cedar Rapids looks to rebuild, Joe has moved into a new position as the Executive Administrator of Development Services. It's a great title. Joe has an extended history of leadership roles, Executive Director of Iowa Finance Authority, the Interim Deputy Director of the Iowa Department of Economic Development, Fannie Mae Director of Iowa Partnership Office and Community Business Center, and the Secretary's representative for the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. So there really isn't much that Joe hasn't done in this economic and community development field. And our final speaker will be Kamyar Enshayan, who is the director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Education at the University of Northern Iowa. I know we've had University of Iowa and ISU, so it's great to have University of Northern Iowa represented here. He is a mechanical engineer and has worked in food and agriculture for the last 25 years. Kamyar is the 2008 recipient of the Sustainable Agriculture Achievement Award by the Practical Farmers of Iowa. and he helped establish the Cedar River Watershed Coalition. And as a member of the City Council, he helped establish, assisted in the adoption of the 500-year floodplain ordinance, which was referred to in the previous session. He teaches classes in environmental studies and serves on the board of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So I want to welcome our speakers and turn it over to Dick.
Well, thank you all for asking me to come and try to share what insights I do have. Sometimes it's been quite a learning experience for me I started out being involved in watershed work from the nutrient standards, looking at nitrate levels that had been increasing in our rivers in Iowa. And so then we had gotten into that a little ways with our project in my Lime Creek watershed area. And then the floods came along, and I just felt like, well, we have to look at how farming affects flooding too. And so that's what we started to do. I had some help putting these slides together from Aaron Andrews as a field coordinator down at the Iowa Learning Farms. And it's Dr. Matt Helmer's research up in his watershed where he grew up. And what he did there, since he started there and he's doing it in a few other areas in Iowa. And so this kind of works off of what Dr. Cruz showed us earlier. But when you look at the Water Erosion Prediction Project, they have a model that looks at all the details of how you've used the land and the kind of crops and the rotations, the tillage practices, and all that across the period of years. And so then he documented in the watershed where he grew up, southeast of Sibley, Iowa, how over a period of years, that's on the one axis, and then the number of acres on another axis, and the third axis is the various crops that we might choose to grow. So you can see how the row crops have increased over the years, and pasture and small grains have decreased fairly dramatically and stuff. And then looking at how that affects in the watershed, the amount of erosion that had taken place over those periods of years. And so you can see that we have made some progress on soil erosion practices. We don't see as much red in there, but the model does show not just water or sediment that leaves the ground, but moves around on the ground, which can be just as damaging, because then you end up losing yield on the hilltops, and you don't really gain any yield for that in the lower areas either. So moving to strip till and no-till with these models makes a pretty dramatic improvement over what we're currently doing, but it also, you can still see that there are a lot of red areas, and that helps demonstrate the importance of reducing tillage, but also having grass waterways and the need for riparian areas to be protected in other ways. This was the slide that I really thought showed dramatically how before we started plowing up the prairies, we didn't lose very much. We had less than a half ton an acre of soil loss. So we were building organic matter pretty clearly over the prairies over all these thousands of years. Well, then by the 30s, we were tilling enough soil and doing fairly aggressive tillage. And then in the 50s and 70s, we were still doing a lot of aggressive tillage. And then also losing some of our small grains and alfalfa, the perennials in our land. And then to where we are now, we are starting to make some dramatic improvements on the amount of tillage that we're doing. And we could further increase our soil saving, which is the darker bar, by using strip till and no-till. But the amount of water that leaves the land, that runs off the land, is the blue bars, and that is pretty clearly not making the same kind of progress that we've been making with sediment delivery. So what this all leads up to basically is that you have to take a whole farm approach to looking at individual farms. What I did in our performance-based management group we used a soil conditioning index to identify whether we're building organic matter or we're losing organic matter. And then we could affect that by changing our rotations and tillage practices. The things that you can't change is how much slope there is on your field, the soil types, a lot of things like that. But by using contour farming or a lot of other things, you start to work those into those fields and identify where you can make the best gains for the management changes that you have available. Another one that is used commonly is a field print calculator. That one's online. It requires you to put in all your passes that you're making through the field, what you're doing with those acres, and then draws you a spidergram that shows your sustainability indexes and stuff. So there's a lot of variety of tools that are out there and stuff. But most of these tools, I find that while I was always a math geek in school, and so it was like, oh, good hard numbers for me to work with. These really show when I'm making progress and things like that. That doesn't excite a lot of farmers that way. They don't. They're just like, yeah, what are you telling me here? It's like, so in order to use some of these, even be able to start to approach farmers with a lot of these, we have to have a lot of technical assistance, either through extension or our NRCS office, the IDOLS people. We have to have those well-trained technical people out there. They can be other NGOs, commodity groups. There's a lot of different places that farmers can reach out to access information. We want that to be well documented with our science-based research, and so that we can make confidence that when we're advising farmers on a practice, that it will reach and have a performance outcome that will help us all. So that's my pitch for more money for people, not so much money for land, I guess. When you think about what you're going to do with a pool of resources that is public money, I think one of the places where we could get a lot of bang for our buck would be in greater education outreach to farmers and it has to be farm-based. It has to be the fields that they know, that they're already familiar with. You need to go into that with the respect that that farmer knows that farm best. And he knows what he's tried, and he knows what's worked for him. He needs resources available and stuff. But what you're trying to do is encourage farmers to do better planning as far as what they're going to do over a period of years to have a long-term perspective on this. I guess that's some of the stuff that I talked about there. Anyway, I wanted to show you some pictures too before I get booted off here. Basically, the infield type practices or anything that we can do out in the field to slow water down. So I contour a lot of my fields. You can see how they turn across as they go across the field. What I've done here on this field is about a 40-acre area or whatever, where I've put in these contoured prairie filter strips, and they're 30 feet wide. Then there's about 180 feet of cropland between them, and the lower one is 60 feet wide. So this is this is an outgrowth of some of what I've learned from going to the programs where they talked about the Neil Smith strips project. One of the nice things about these prairie is the diversity of plants that's out in there. I've got 29 species, I think it was, on my list that were forbs and grasses and different native species. They have large root systems that can stop residue. It'll provide some native pollinator habitat. I have quail nesting out in this sort of grass. I was out walking in it, and it's like, okay, I'm going to walk around them, leave them alone. You can see the eggs laying out there in the sun. Well, when it wasn't raining anyway. So filter strips, crop rotations, no-till, waterways, keeping your waterways effective with berms, things like that. Another type, this was where I no-tilled corn after corn. I did drill rye into this field. It's hard to see the rye plants that had been burned down 2 weeks before I planted this corn, so almost a month by the time we get to now. And but learning how having cover crops, this was corn after soybeans that had rye after the soybeans. There's still an ear of corn out there from 2011, so not all the mice have eaten everything that's out there. And so there's other opportunities that we could use where I'm promoting cover crops. This is my first year. I've got a 13-acre hilltop that I decided I was going to grow some rye. The price of rye got up to about $17 a bushel last fall. I decided, well, geez, if for that, I think I could grow my own rye on some of my marginal soils. So I guess when we're looking at where the placement of some of these places on farms would be for a small number of acres that a person could add some small grains in, and you could do this in the contours, have filter strips made with a harvested crop that way. You could plant them down in the toe of a contoured field so you wouldn't have all those short rows that farmers hate when you start talking about contours. There might be opportunities where we could start to build some more resilience into our fields that way. One of the last things I put up was this idea of we have the census that we do every 10 years or so. And so then, how much corn and how much beans and how much woodland and how much wasteland. Well, all right, what's wasteland? How valuable is wasteland? This was an area where the cedar floods out every time it gets to about 8 feet. It starts to go out into those woods, and there's quite a few acres that a farmer has out there that's just nothing done with because it floods there regularly, but he doesn't get any payment for having that absorption ability in the watershed. So it's just an interesting. I think the Earth Economics pointed this out pretty well last year in their program. So, thank you.
Good morning. Joe O'Hearn, and here from the city of Cedar Rapids. I'm going to focus on what we did locally after the 2008 floods. And you may remember from my introduction, I wasn't here right after the floods. I was still at the Iowa Finance Authority, but I was involved at the state level, at the state level response to the floods. But what I want to talk for a few minutes about is the response here and some of the innovative things I think Cedar Rapids did do. And I think if you were here this morning when the city manager talked, you'll hear a lot of echoes of what he had to say this morning. I want to say that wasn't planned, but it is, I think, sort of a dominant theme that you would hear from people who were in Cedar Rapids in Lynn County after the flood and the activity that went on. This first slide up here just shows the inundation area. And it shows that based on the 100-year floodplain that was in existence at the time, FEMA has since redrawn. Actually, they were in the process of redrawing those maps prior to the flood, but they hadn't completed that prior to the 2008 flood. But it shows the 100-year, the 500-year, and then the yellow is really the total inundation area. So you can see two things I want you to see out of this is, one, the fact that the flooding went well beyond the 100-year, well beyond the 500-year in Cedar Rapids, and two, take a look at where this is. This is absolutely in the core of this community, both on the west side of the river and on the east side of the river. If you're familiar at all with Cedar Rapids, you know the east side of the river is what we call our downtown, all the tall buildings and all those things that go with a downtown, but really the core of this community. It's not something that you pick up and move out of the 100-year floodplain. It's where reality sort of meets ideal planning. You just don't move not only all that brick and mortar and all that investment, but all that infrastructure and really the economic network that goes into building a community. That's just not something that is replicated overnight that you can pick up and move. So I will probably just leave that. I don't know if I can go forward. Here's another picture of showing some of the impacts of that, what that other map represents. But you can see how deep the water got in the downtown and really, the extent of the impact. But two things I want to emphasize in terms of innovation that I think Cedar Rapids really excelled at after the flood. The first one was planning. You have to remember floods are different. All floods are different from one flood to the next, one community to the next, and all disasters are different as to how they impact a community. I think one of the problems with designing recovery programs is there are no two responses and recoveries that are the same. But floods are fundamentally different from other types of disasters. Different from tornadoes, different from even hurricanes, in that in those two types of disasters you see a lot of rebuilding in place. There's a natural sort of function that says, okay, if we had a tornado, we can rebuild in place. The risk isn't any greater or lesser that it's going to happen again. So there's an acknowledgement that we'll rebuild in place. In a flood, the first thing that happens is people say, should we rebuild there? And even the federal government's response is predicated on, let's take a look at where the inundation happened. What does that mean about rebuilding? Cedar Rapids really embraced that planning effort. In a lot of situations, in a lot of communities, that planning can take an awful long time depending on the type of disaster, the extent of the disaster, where it occurred in a community. But Cedar Rapids really embraced that planning. We held 3 workshops in Cedar Rapids, 3 open public meetings in the fall of 2008, right after the flood, to talk about what kind of flood protection would the community like to see based on what had just happened. The community was shown 3 alternatives, asked to discuss those alternatives, and pick a flood management plan. And that did happen in the fall of 2008. Act was actually adopted by the City Council in November of 2008. Very, very aggressive response to that event, and I think really had a lot to do with where we've gotten to in terms of, we haven't built flood protection yet, but in terms of some of the approvals that we've received, and I'll discuss that in a minute. But that's some of the representations. The community really decided that they didn't want to be cut off from the river, but they wanted the river to be part of the community, but also acknowledged that, as the city manager said this morning, that we needed to let the river breathe, if you will, and there was a large dedication of, in the upper left-hand side of that slide, you can see the green space up there, a dedication of what had been residential areas to green space. And we did use FEMA money to buy out over 100 properties up in that area to make dedicate to green space. Oop, I'm going the wrong way there. So the planning that the community engaged in was very aggressive. The second stage of that planning, once they looked at the flood management structure, was in the first half of 2009 to do some neighborhood planning. And there were 8 public meetings in the affected neighborhoods, in 10 affected neighborhoods, to really talk about where do these neighborhoods go from here in terms of a response and rebuilding after the inundation. Over 1,400 citizens attended those planning processes, those public meetings to come out with visions for their neighborhoods. And that really did leave us with a plan of what to do in those neighborhoods. Over 150 projects were identified, not all of them city projects, some of them private projects, but gave us a good roadmap to guide future activity after that flood event. So I think the planning was a very aggressive, very innovative approach to beginning a response. The second element that I want to stress is the amount of new programs that the city, working, as the city manager said, working with its state and federal partners, had to work on. This flood event happened in an environment that was, I'll just label it this way, a post-Katrina environment. The federal government had identified what they considered to be some flaws in their process based on what had happened in the Katrina disaster recovery efforts. One of the terms that I learned after the 2008 flood was something called duplication of benefits. And if you've been involved in any flood recovery or disaster recovery programs, that's not a word you want or a phrase you want to hear. The federal government was in the process of trying to determine how they would compare benefits across the federal programs that get involved in a disaster recovery effort. Those involved, I'll just name three, but SBA, FEMA, and the Community Development Block Grant that comes from HUD. Those three are major programs that had been used to fund disaster recovery activities. The federal government was beginning a process, or I wouldn't say beginning, but in the process of developing a methodology of how they looked at how individuals and businesses were impacted by activities from all three programs. And so they were asked to develop a process to compare benefits across those three and other programs. First hurdle was all three have privacy conditions on them. So they first had to figure out how they were going to share information with themselves at the federal government level, with the state government, and with local governments, and how individuals could share those so we could know what a duplication of benefits issue might look like. I can't tell you how many thousands of hours that discussion chewed up between the state and the federal partners, between local entities like the city of Cedar Rapids and the state agencies. Anyway, we had to designing programs to meet the needs of a community after a disaster is a difficult task to start with, because every disaster is different and the community needs are different. And the federal programs don't, particularly the Community Development Block Grant, which is considered one of the most flexible federal programs, don't necessarily, aren't designed to fit a disaster recovery effort. They are just used in a disaster recovery effort. There is a stack of waivers that the federal government has developed that they hand you that are a starting point from the traditional CDBG program to a disaster recovery CDBG program, because they've learned over the years all the things they have to do, some of the things they have to do differently with that program to make it even usable. So I say that to say, as the city manager said this morning, we sat down with our partners at the federal and state level and the affected individuals and businesses, and really try to design programs that would meet those needs and get over where we could, where we needed to, and where it was desired to get over this duplication of benefit issues. Just one example. And a lot of the businesses, one of the resources that was available right after any disaster is an SBA loan. And for a lot of businesses, that's the quickest way to get cash to stay in business. You come along later, after you've developed your programs with these other resources and try and provide assistance to a business, you may end up simply repaying the SBA loan. Some cases that's not all bad. If the business needs to, if their resultant need is to reduce their debt, paying that loan off so they don't have that debt burden can be a good thing. But if they have additional needs, and this can be true for a homeowner too, if they have additional needs, giving them the additional resources that are simply drained away to pay down an SBA loan doesn't move them any further ahead in their recovery. So it was a monumental task to design programs to get around that duplication of benefit issue, or not get around, but accommodate it. So what we did end up with are programs to both, as the city manager said this morning, we have lost a lot of housing in this community. Over 1,300 homes have been, or 1,300 parcels have been purchased. We've lost about 1,200 residents in that process. We have replaced over 1,300 housing units through a combination of multifamily programs that were developed and some replacement housing programs that provided down payment assistance not only to flood-affected families, but down payment assistance to replace housing that was lost as a result of the disaster. We also developed programs to rehab homes that people wanted to stay in, actually both home ownership and rental units. And so some 2,300 units were repaired using those programs. Those are somewhat standard responses, although the down payment assistance had to go through a number of hurdles to get by this new duplication of benefits issue, but we did some good creative work with our state and federal partners and got that done. But on the business side, it was very unusual to try and use block grant programs to provide assistance to businesses. Again, looking at that map, you can see the impact on the business community in this community. And so providing that assistance to businesses was very important here. What we did is we designed programs for working capital, equipment replacement, flood insurance reimbursement, interest payment reimbursement. We didn't, where the business didn't want to give up or pay down the SBA loan, we could make the burden of that SBA loan by making part of the interest payments for them for about 3 years. We also worked on rental assistance for both tenants and landlords, and really had a large success in keeping businesses in the community. The results for all of this were that we had, Army Corps of Engineer initial approval for our flood protection plan on the east side in 18 months instead of typically five years or so. That approval is now going through Congress. It's passed the Senate. We have hopes that it will pass the House of Representatives, and we would have flood protection at the federal level approved on the east side. We also had approval at the state level, as you've heard, on the Growth Reinvestment Act, I think largely based on the fact that we had a plan and we could talk about that plan. And you've heard about the success we've had in acquiring property and replacing housing units. I want to say I think the planning that happened in this community was very aggressive and unusual, and the creativity of the community and the federal and state partners in designing flood recovery programs and disaster recovery programs, frankly, are now being copied in other places because we were able to work through these duplication of benefit issues, is something that we take a lot of pride in and has helped us greatly in our recovery. Thank you.
It's really great to be here with you. I'm a native Iowan who was born in Iran. And I want to share with you a sense of restlessness and urgency. There is a lot of excitement around math, science, and engineering these days. STEM education is seen as critical. Governors are promoting it. Legislators are funding it. But when math and science produces knowledge that is contrary to the current pattern of commerce, yet essential to living in safety and security, decision makers often ignore it. And as a result, there is damage, destruction, and suffering. I will offer 3 examples, 1 at home and 2 upstream, of factors exacerbating Iowa's chronic flood problems, where math and science and engineering clearly offer robust knowledge and clear directions, but the political and moral courage is lacking to turn that knowledge into action in the public interest. So number 1 is the knowledge of the importance of floodplain, which we just heard quite a bit about. Based on centuries of math and science, we've known that floodplain is the home of the river, and the floodplain is vital infrastructure providing numerous services, improving water quality, reducing peak flood elevation, all for free. Floodplains are not idle pieces of land waiting to be developed, but we keep ignoring this basic knowledge. Oops, no, I don't know where. Okay, here we go. There we go. That's okay. All right. Even after the floods of 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, and now 2013, the state laws relating to floodplains have remained the same, which is allowing filling and construction within the 100-year floodplain, and therefore expanding the flood hazard area. And as Bill mentioned, the recommendations was to go beyond that. We were stuck there. And I see it in Waterloo area where they're just building like crazy in the 100-year floodplain. Few Iowa communities have paid attention to math and science and enacted ordinances that protect their floodplains and give more room to the river. So there is a perfect opportunity for local governments and really all of us here today to lead. My community of Cedar Falls has adopted a common sense floodplain ordinance based on evidence and experience, effective January 1, 2010, and has the following features. The first one basically is just dealing with reality, right? That 500-year flood elevation is the regulatory flood elevation. And the second bullet point, basically no new subdivision is like no parking on the interstate highway. It's like no parking in the floodplain. And you can see these are the features of Cedar Falls. And as I understand, Iowa City has adopted similar ordinances, but that's it. What about everybody else? Des Moines is building in the floodplain. Ames is building in the floodplain. I mean, everything is the same. So that's why I'm talking about restlessness. I mean, things are about the same as they were. People are building in the floodplain. So what are we doing? We need to get busy here. All right. Because, as Joe mentioned, we can't just always pick up and move. We need to invest in upstream solutions. So the second example of ignoring versus using the best of math and science in the decision-making process is the knowledge of cropping systems' impact on Iowa. So here, math and science done by ISU, DNR, NRCS, USGS, USDA, and the National Soil Tilth Lab all continue to reveal that the current simple conventional cropping system, which is continuous corn or corn bean, has brought us soil erosion, loss of soil organic matter, soil compaction, and overall soil quality degradation. It has brought us fertilizer pollution in our streams and drinking water supplies. It has brought us pesticides in our drinking water supplies, and it has brought us herbicide-resistant weeds. We know these things. There's hard proof of these things, okay? Now, these are inherent properties of corn bean cropping system. No matter how careful a farmer is, these problems will not go away. It's abundantly clear that the current cropping system is not serving Iowa. It's just not. And as I drove down today, every field looked like this. Every field looked like this. And if we care about Iowa, as we say we do, we must work hard to change this system. In this case, it's mostly Washington, through a system of incentives and subsidies, that has encouraged the current cropping system that doesn't serve Iowa. Unlike the first one, where it's not Washington that's making us build in the floodplain, it's our own doing. Washington didn't come to the city of Waterloo and said, yeah, build in the floodplain. You have to build in the floodplain. But in this case, we really don't have a lot of choice, because the farm subsidies are the ones that are encouraging the cropping system that we've got. That's why what Richard said is very important, because those incentives need to change. So the good news for Iowa is that things need not be this way, that it is possible and practical to have a productive agriculture that enhances soil and water quality for generations to come. ISU agronomist Matt Liebman and his colleagues have documented the result of 10 years of field research in Iowa involving the addition of a third crop in the rotation, as Richard mentioned. The findings are extraordinary compared to the corn bean cropping system. The yields and profits are high. 88% less herbicide use. It's incredible. 80% less synthetic nitrogen used. Substantially less soybean disease. 50% less energy used. And most importantly, improved soil structure that Rick Cruz was talking about, improved soil structure, reduced bulk density, and that's the part that really helps with holding water. Wow. I mean, this is a huge scientific discovery. Why aren't we hearing about this? This is what we need. This is the most important thing, in my mind, that solves a lot of our problems in Iowa. This cropping system is, it works, it's time-tested. Math and science have brought us this robust knowledge. This cropping system is beautiful, it's elegant, it solves multiple problems. It's far more important than the Mars landing and deserves more attention. IDALs, NRCS, ISU, and farm organizations should rally around these findings. And it should become our #1 nutrient reduction strategy. State leaders must tell Congress, we want policies that support this kind of cropping system. This science shows that agriculture can be a source of land health and biodiversity, that soil-enhancing, river-friendly agriculture is possible, and practical and profitable. Studies of landscapes dominated by this type of diverse cropping system reveal that when subjected to huge rainfall events, these are less flashy and offer significant reduction in peak flood elevation. Cities should pay attention and support these diverse cropping systems. So it's not just, okay, let's build flood walls. We really need to think about these upstream solutions. The last upstream solution I want to talk about is the knowledge of what is disrupting our fragile atmosphere. Again, through math and science, we now know that the burning of fossil energy is destabilizing our climate, leading to more extreme weather, which we heard, more extreme rainfall in Iowa, and making our region less habitable. The science is clear, yet there is very little action at local, state, or federal levels. You would think in a state so dependent on agriculture, so dependent on a stable climate, that we would take science seriously, but we're not. We're just not taking science seriously. So that's really the crisis of science We're just not, everybody talks about math and science, but we really aren't serious. We know how community planning can lead to significant energy conservation in a community. We have a variety of renewable energy solutions available. Cities where most flood damage has occurred should be a major force in encouraging utility companies to divest from fossil energy and invest in renewables, because that's the long-term upstream solution that's leading to the issues we're dealing with. So these are examples of the bad habit of foolishly ignoring well-established science when it doesn't support all ways of doing business. But the issue is far more important than that, and it's a moral issue. We've done hard things before. We've solved seemingly intractable problems. Remember, and again, maybe others will talk about this later, don't have to go that far, but if we want to go that far, slavery was very profitable and legal. But people before us took the bold step of ending it because it conflicted with our nation's ideal of freedom that we said we valued. Building in the floodplain, damaging our soils, and treating our atmosphere as a dump are all right now profitable and legal. And they're in conflict with our love of our country. They are in conflict with our moral duty to our country. Wendell Berry asks, to what extent do we defend from foreign enemies a country that we ourselves are destroying? In all the cases, all three cases, acting in the best interest of our town, state, and nation, based on what we already know, is an urgent necessity and an honorable act. And we must be bold to implement what we know, even if the current patterns of commerce work against us doing the right thing. That's it.
So we've got about 10 minutes until lunch. Looks like we've already got some questions. And please, if you have additional ones, raise your hands or raise your card. Okay, Dick, this is for you. How do we change the all too common belief held by most Iowa farmers and promoted by agribusiness? 1, pour on the fertilizer. 2, plant the corn thick. And 3, pray for rain.
A little closer. Sorry. Everything gets to be a case-by-case study as far as, productivity of soils and stuff like that. But a lot of times people go for something simple, it seems like, so that they can manage more acres, so that they can stretch themselves that much thinner, to where they treat all the ground the same. And I think you just need to educate people as far as what the problems with that are. I think they're pretty obvious to a lot of us, that see a large piece of equipment pulling into a field and go, uh-oh, you can just about see that the rains are going to come and there's going to be problems. When you see water running at the edges of waterways instead of in the waterway, it's like there's some infield management things that somebody's not respecting, whether the farmer that understands how to get water into the waterway isn't involved. It's like the people don't ask. You don't want to just go to your neighbor and say, "Hey, I see you got a problem there." It's kind of they'd shut you off right away. So you just have to try to find ways where you can have programs, educate people about what you do on your own farm. Maybe that's kind of what I've been focusing on, I guess. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. Joe, why has Cedar Rapids built an authorized building in the 100-year and 500-year floodplain, in clear contradiction of wisdom to the contrary and with no flood protection?
Well, if you go back to that picture that I put up there, there's a huge amount of investment already in the 500-year floodplain in this community, and it's also part of that economic fabric that makes up this community. It is difficult, I would say impossible, unless you can find a funding source, a huge funding source to pick up and move that kind of investment. So when we try to balance maintaining the economic and community vitality of a community that's built around a river, we obviously have trade-offs. Now, in our flood management structure plan, as I said, we did open up, it's over 200 acres that the city committed to green space in that plan. And I think that is a pretty large investment within the city borders of green space that had been residential and commercial property. So that's what we're trying to do is balance the need of rebuilding the community and having economic and community vitality with the realities of what we know are, climate change and increased risks of flooding. To the question of why we don't have flood protection, I would say these processes move very, very slowly, and we wish they would move more quickly. But as I said, we were fortunate to have a Army Corps approval of a flood protection system within 18 months of the event instead of 5 years. We well could be sitting here today without any activity of the Corps to look at flood protection in Cedar Rapids, and instead we have an approval of a system on the east side, we have design work that's been done, and we have legislation that's already been passed by the U.S. Senate and hopefully will be passed by the House. So there is a balancing act going on, and there is not one good way to go about this. You really are balancing competing interests.
Okay, Kamyar, short but profound question. So are you saying that these floods are legislated events?
Well, there are some that we have. I mean, the issues that I outlined are issues we have control over. So the part that we can control to reduce flood damage is not to build in the floodplain, work upstream, create a more resilient landscape, and go further upstream and look at forces that are destabilizing the climate. So those are really, those are things we think we know we have some control over.
Here's a question. Sorry, yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Joe, I would encourage you to go online and look at what the older towns and communities in Germany and some of the European countries did, because, like they say, the heart of their business, the tourism, was their downtown, and yet they're having flooding. But like Kamyar said, what they did is they got organized as a watershed. They went upstream and actually financed larger retention basins than what we could build on island. Granted. But have you heard of many European countries being flooded?
Sure.
A little bit. But what I hear us saying is that you have established a principle of slavery is with us, so there's no way that we should end it.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't make that comparison, but let me say that we're also involved. We're also active in these watershed activities. We're not ignoring that. And in the planning we did, and the flood protection concept that we adopted, a number of the activities that were listed on that plan were watershed planning activities. But that's not something Cedar Rapids can do on its own. And in fact, if Cedar Rapids were to go north or upstream and go to an upstream county and shake our finger at that county and say, you got to do more watershed planning, I don't think that would be well received. But we are trying to work with those watershed planning activities, and we would be very supportive of efforts to improve the watershed planning that's going on. It's just not something we can do on our own, nor can we sort of plan that it is going to happen, and therefore we don't have to do other things.
Okay, any more questions here? Yes.
I wonder if Mr. O'Hearn is aware of the Cedar River Watershed Coalition, where there's very little fingership going on.
No, I agree.
A great deal of collaborative conversation, and Cedar Rapids has neglected to participate in with any consistency.
So the question for the video is whether Mr. O'Hearn is aware of the Cedar River Watershed Coalition, and why has there not been consistent participation by Cedar Rapids?
Well, consistency, I don't know about. We are aware of it, and we have participated in it, and it is something we'd be supportive of. Whether we've made every meeting or not, I don't know.
Well, final question, I think this would be for Dick, is corporate farming is on the increase. At what degree do corporate farms use the whole farm approach, and will it be necessary to legislate this approach?
I guess I don't know how. It depends on corporate farms being integrated with the communities still. Even if it's a small farmer or if it's a corporate farm, they can still do a good job. I know some large farmers that do a great job of soil conservation, and I'm working on getting them to add more tools to their toolbox, because there's always more that we're learning. But I think, that gets to be an economic thing of trying to point a finger at one particular type of farm. I think corporates can be good citizens. They have to maybe have a longer term outlook instead of thinking in terms of just 1 year's profit. What can they do in 1 year? Or, I think any of these systems I'm talking about are involving, some real planning and thinking ahead for what the best use of that land is in the long term, rather than just trying to mine it out quickly and get your profit and take your money and go. So.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking our speakers and